This is Invisible Inc., the podcast for under-resourced women entrepreneurs, and I'm your host, Shubha Chakravarti, founder of Achieve. Join me as I talk to women entrepreneurs about the nuts and bolts of their journeys and to experts who will give you insights that are hard to find anywhere else. Let's jump in. What's the single surprising thing you must get right as a founder before setting the compensation for your team? How can you avoid the typical pitfalls of early-stage founders on HR issues so they don't come back to bite you later? What do you need to know about stock option plans and incentives so you're setting up the best possible environment for your team and for your startup to succeed? In this episode, startup advisor, HR expert, and former chief people officer Susan Lovegren talks about what founders need to know about the strategic and tactical issues of managing HR, how to avoid the typical mistakes early founders make, the bird's eye view of setting up solid stock option and incentive plans, and much more. Now, here's Susan. Good afternoon, Susan. Welcome to Invisible Inc. We're so excited to have you here.
I'm excited to be here.
So tell us a little bit about your experiences in the startup world, particularly from an HR perspective.
It's kind of interesting. I spent most of my career working for publicly traded companies, large organizations, lots of infrastructure, lots of different departments and support. And I was finding that in the larger companies, it was a little bit more of Groundhog's Day, if you will. It was a little bit too much of the same thing over and over, but I was a little bit, very candidly, a little bit bored. And I wanted to have much more skin in the game and be much more a part of building something. And certainly looking into everything going on in the startup world, I thought, well, why not? My last two jobs were actually in a privately held pre-IPO company. The last one was Medallia, which did go public in July of 2019 and had the opportunity to the company going public of being hands-on, fully integrated in the preparation for that big event. And prior to that, I had a very different experience. I worked for a company called AppDynamics. We were probably within 12 months of going public. And lo and behold, we actually wound up getting acquired by Cisco. So that was a very different experience. We were 36 hours away from going public, going to New York to stand on the podium, the whole thing. Parties were all planned. Food was ordered. And it was a no-go. Instead, we spent that day talking to all of our employees about being acquired and what that actually meant. So two very different experiences, both great experiences, but very different from each other.
That sounds super exciting. I can't wait to dive into all the details. What has been the most counterintuitive thing about HR when it comes to the startup world?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And it's not just the startup world. I would say this applies to pretty much any organization. I think there's this perception that HR is more of a administrative function. And I think the biggest thing that is counterintuitive is what an outstanding business partner HR can be to a CEO, to a founder, to the executive team. And when I say business, it's truly business in terms of going out, meeting with clients, customers, meeting with investors, working with your employees, talent, culture, being that confidant, coach. It is truly the only functional area that cuts across all of the disciplines within the company. So I think the thing that's counterintuitive is to look for a head of HR who thinks like a CEO or a founder. And that is pretty counterintuitive for a lot of founders. The really great CEOs that I have worked with, they absolutely value the partnership and lean on the talents of HR to really help them run the business. I think it's counterintuitive to think about your head of HR going out and meeting with your customers or being a person involved in a conference, speaking on behalf of your company, or playing very integral roles that can add tons of value to your company. Someone, as an example, that I think about often, I think has done a great job is Patty McCord. She was the Netflix CHRO, and she and her founder really were the two key people who developed the culture and the manifesto around how Netflix would run. So it wasn't just the culture of words on the board, but really driving all the policies around talent, around hiring, around how compensation schemes would work, how investments would be made. And that kind of a partnership added just incredible value to the success of the company. So when you think of culture, it's not just in values, it's not just the design of that, but it's really the pull through into the business. I would kind of leave you with, think of HR as a game changer versus a people or paper pusher.
It's very clear to me listening to you that you have loved being a business partner, kind of having your hands in the business aspects. I love that. Has there been anything over and above that that's been particularly enjoyable to you being part of HR in a startup environment?
There's been quite a few, and I'll kind of do this in two parts. One was with a company that is a public company in which the product was very relatable to the consumer, that really focused on integrated communications and devices. And the company was Plantronics, and it has since become Poly, and then Hewlett Packard bought it. But what was so fun about that job was we showcased all of our products with our employees. All of our employees used the product. It was part of the culture. We had our meetings specifically designed around using the products. We did a lot of testing. A lot of the employee population was involved in the marketing. And there was just this real camaraderie that went on and this integration of product placement, speaking about the product. And it turned into this entire campaign called Smarter Working, which was so much fun because everything that we did was about smarter working. So it drove our business, it drove our culture, it drove the way in which people physically worked. We designed our building and all of our signals to the employee around the Smarter Working Manifesto. And that was truly exciting to be a part of something like that. And it wasn't just, an HR program that's separate from the company, but it was completely integrated into everything the company did. So that was one example. The other very interesting thing I'm doing now is I'm an advisor to 6 different companies, and they are all in the HR technology space. So what's really fun for me is to think about their mission, what each of them is trying to accomplish, and how, from an HR perspective, how I think about those solutions and being able to provide feedback to those founders, to those investors about what's working, what wouldn't work.
You're talking about startups which are in the HR tech business, and then there's HR and startups. So my question to you is, in what way does HR as a function in itself in a startup environment differ in significant dimensions from HR in a regular, more mature company, whether public or private?
There's a fairly big difference. When you're just starting a company, obviously a lot of founders, maybe they're short on funds, they are not necessarily investing in HR. So typically the first role that gets filled in startups is talent. So typically people are trying to grow their company, they're trying to get the right people in seats, and if they have any funding, and usually some of it's going to go towards a couple of key hires. So talent acquisition is typically the first area. So to think of it as your chief talent officer is a pretty critical role at that stage. That person is really on the hook for, getting your brand out there, creating the employee value proposition, working with the founder about the story. How are you going to communicate the values, the culture? What's important in terms of who you're hiring? Hiring and labor are going to be your most significant investments for the most part. They're going to also be the source of probably some of your most significant problems. So it's kind of a double-edged sword, and getting hiring right is super important. The other thing I would say in the beginning, go to market. Super important. It's going to be about sales for a long time. And without sales, you don't really have a business. I mean, you're maybe in R&D for a little bit, but that runs out. And your cycles are going to be longer before you become public. That's another trend that has been pretty well documented. So in the past, you can see maybe 2 to 5 years a company going public if it was on a high growth path. Now it's more around 6, 8 years on average. The 2 companies that I was with that were going public, one was 8 years, an 8-year-old startup, and the other was a 20-year-old startup. And there's some reasons for that. Obviously, the investors are trying to have the company be worth more. So when they do go public, they have a better opportunity to recoup on those investments. But that creates also some interesting challenges for founders. So if you don't go public, that creates a much longer trajectory, if you will, for employees to keep your employees satisfied before they have any sort of significant reward. Going back to that, your head of talent is very important. That's probably your first key position. And that person has to be, in my mind, pretty multifaceted, meaning they can set up some basic operations. They know how to sell. They know how to sell the company. And they also are a truth teller to that CEO in terms of values and culture. That's kind of the first team you get in line. Second, you're probably going to need somebody who has a pretty good handle on compensation. And the reason I talk about compensation, people don't often think about it's more of it's kind of technical back office function. But the decisions that are made around comp early on stay with you for a very long time. So in terms of design and getting things right, and in terms of how you're going to motivate people, how you're going to pay people, how competitive or non-competitive you're going to be, all of those decisions become pretty important. And as the time goes on with the company, that function, it carries a lot of weight. That's the function that's going to be meeting with your board, your advisors, helping you stay honest with your stock programs and all of those other things that are going to come if you have that level of success. So I'd say those things are kind of different. Once you become more mature, then you're going to want somebody who has probably done the job, in my opinion, because there's so much that has to be done. You can pick a high potential person. I've seen that. You get somebody in there who's got a lot of capabilities, but they just don't have the experience quite yet. Typically, I'll get a call from those founders saying, I need to pull out. I need to get somebody in here with the experience. We're 1 or 2 years away, 3 years away, even 5 years away, and we got to scale. And this person has just no idea how to do that. You can start off, I think, a little bit smaller. You get some of the core things built. And then as you start moving along, you start getting a little bit more experienced person. Then hopefully you'll get an experienced CHRO. That's what I've seen.
That's an excellent explanation. So it sounds to me like the early stages are much more around setting a foundation that's going to cast very long shadows, so to speak. You're going to have to live with it for a really long time, and it's hard to undo. And then as you stabilize more, then you kind of go into the more traditional talent set of a CHRO and a little bit less risk from an impact on the business perspective. So along these lines, what are the top mistakes you see founders make when it comes to managing these critical functions on the HR side early on?
There's a few. One critical mistake is a lot of CEOs don't have a very good listening strategy, both a programmatic listening strategy, but also really listening. And that's listening to the employees, listening to their advisors, listening to their mentors, and not necessarily feeling that they have to be the smartest person in the room. Some CEOs, what I've seen, and when I will get a phone call, is when they're in trouble. And meaning they've tried for a long time to solve maybe some of their people problems. They don't really know how, and they just didn't get help soon enough. And all of a sudden things start to unravel in terms of their, executive leadership team or others in the organization. So I think some of that comes from, no offense to anybody, but some founders have awfully big egos, a lot of confidence, and as they should, believe in their product and what they're doing, but sometimes they just don't do a very good job of stopping and listening. The other mistake I think they make is time application. So their time application tends to be with maybe 1 or 2 of the functional areas and not the entire team. So if you're going to hire an entire team to represent, various tasks that need to be done in the company, you really need to ensure that you're spending time and gaining the value out of all of those leaders in your company or all of those positions in your company. So if you're only really hanging out with sales or hanging out with engineering, you're going to miss a lot of things going on in your organization. The other mistake I've seen is with some leaders, depending on the type of leader, is not doing the analytics early and often enough on go-to-market, meaning sales. And what I mean by that is the analytics, really understanding your sales productivity, understanding where you have risk of people leaving your organization, what those costs associated with that are, really understanding what's going on around renewals. It could be understanding placement of where that talent sits physically. And is that the right thing? Are you structured the right way? And really having the analytics around your whole go-to-market and truly around your marketing as well and what you're getting out of that. Where I've seen people really struggle is not having a good handle on that. And all of a sudden, if they lose key talent in that area, and salespeople are very coin operated, again, no offense to anybody, but it's just what I've seen. It's just been the truth. And if you don't have a good handle on that and you're not comping people in a way that is motivating and paying attention to that, you could find yourself in a lot of trouble.
I love how you painted this picture, because what it's telling me in a very loud and powerful way is that once you're a founder, once you've taken on a leadership role of growing your company into something bigger and more scalable, your strategy begins to matter a lot. And then your performance on the strategy, which means you have to get out of your comfort zone in areas that don't feel like home to you. What I picked up from what you just laid out was the specific way that the dots connect to then end up in an HR implication or consequence from a leadership failure.
Absolutely.
Which brings me back to the main question. So you're starting out as a founder, or I imagine it's all in one big pot of, I need to get this business up and running and I need to show traction, product market fit, whatever the latest buzzword is, in Silicon Valley. So you don't think about all these functions as specific disciplines that require their own approaches. So how should a founder proactively start thinking about, oh, this is an HR issue, and what are the milestones that they should be triggering in their minds to go to action and to actually take conscious decisions around HR in this journey?
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts. One thing that I think many of the VC firms do well, they have a lot of resources depending on who you're partnering with. And many of those folks know HR people, and they can even help you with an interim HR person. So somebody to come in and help you establish and assess kind of where you're at and what you actually need. These investors have a lot at stake, and they know tons of great people. And certainly that's what I've seen work pretty effectively. Somebody to come in for 6 months, go side by side with the CEO. Now, again, kind of going back to talent, if you're all of a sudden going to be needing to hire a bunch of people, then you're probably going to need somebody in HR. If you decide you're going to hire a bunch of people, what are you going to do about things like stock options? Are you going to incent people with any sort of compensation, bonuses? What's it going to be? If you're going to, keep your company at a relatively small size initially, 10 people, 20 people, you may or may not need somebody to help you. Maybe you can, get away with a contractor to kind of help you put some things in place. But I think the telltale signs, when you start getting up around 125 people to 700 people, 700 is kind of an inflection point where you're probably going to need somebody pretty experienced. It starts to get pretty active. And so the activity level is going to come from everything from employee relations issues to maybe even having to lay people off. The economic situation changes. Maybe you're in high growth, maybe you're not. If you're going to be going into a different country or a different region, there's different implications around, just setting up things to meet the labor requirements. You want to be looking at any things that are changing in the law. And again, they'll be like signals to you. There'll be signs of things that you're going to need to start to address. So I'd say it probably depends on how much cash they have, how quickly they're going to grow. I always want to be cautious about overhiring because I don't like to lay people off. That's the worst thing in my world for sure. And I think it's heartbreaking for founders who have so much passion in what they're doing. I'd say 100 people, then, you can maybe get away a little bit for a while with some talent. You have a strong talent person, maybe a good generalist, a good operations person. Once you get to between 500 and 700 people, you're going to have to implement things like some sort of a HRIS system to keep track of your people. You're going to have some sort of incentive programs that you're going to have, you're going to have to hire somebody in stock administration, or you're going to have a consultant in stock administration. So things start to get like a lot more complicated just operationally in terms of setting up a compliant company. And that's why you want to have some of those other fundamental things established, obviously your values. And I don't think I mentioned this, but CEOs, founders, they got to be looking around all the corners. They've got to be looking at the long view. What are the implications, unintended consequences of these decisions early on? Is this sustainable? Can I afford to give these people lunch every day between now and the next 5 years? Truly.
Touche, right? Reading too much in the newspapers these days are on lunches and ping pong tables. So those points are well taken. So two little things on that. One is you mentioned that the advent of institutional investment is an inflection point and gives you a little bit more assurance that you're going to have professional support, especially in terms of HR, whatever other functions you need. So quick variant is there something that an investor or founder needs to be watchful of before they get their first institutional funding? Meaning that's when they don't have anybody to rely on. Are there one or two things that they should just be watchful of?
Obviously, they should be, reading the newspaper, looking online. So things, in our world keep changing. I think the world of work has shifted so much. One thing I'd say they need to be paying attention to is very transparent out there. So everything that you do, you're staking the reputation of your company on. So reputation management, transparency, super, super important. Early days, paying attention to that. Paying attention to changes in the law. So pay transparency is a big shift. There's new legal requirements in the state of California, Washington State, New York. I'm sure others will be coming online. Pay equity, making sure that you're paying people appropriately, that you're thinking about your, just your own values every day. Is this really how I want to behave and perform? Is this how am I modeling the right things for these, even a handful of people I have working around me? What are the boundaries between myself and the people in this company? I do see a mistake, talking a little bit about it. Some of these founders think everybody is your friend. It's a family. And when push comes to shove, that may or may not be the case. You may need to make some very hard decisions. You may find that you're not getting honest feedback from people. And this is what I was referring to with the listening strategy. People may not be telling you what you need to hear because you're their friend, or you're spending too much time being their friend versus focusing on the things you need to do in the business. And we've all seen that. And again, you kind of see those headlines in the newspaper, right? About where things kind of went south. So too many gimmicks, too many things that seem kind of cool in the moment, but really looking at that long view, I think is absolutely critical. But yeah, pay attention to all of those things and pay attention to obviously the business, but then making sure that you're in touch with all your people, that you're ahead of it. There's a lot of data that can help you do this, but if you're sensing somebody is at risk of leaving the company at a critical time, you may want to have more and more risk mitigation strategies in place, and that can take the form of compensation, hitting key milestones. There's a lot of things you can do to de-risk your business. But I think right now, for a founder in those early stages, you do need to think about risk taking, but also managing risk.
I love it. And one other question, you mentioned unintended consequences. Do you have examples of things that CEOs did or have a tendency to do that came back to bite them in ways that they didn't foresee or couldn't have foreseen?
I think some of them would include real estate, getting involved in a long-term lease, or probably spending too much money on accoutrements. And then down the road, when cash is needed for other things, they came up short. Being conservative around things that are going to be more difficult to get out of down the road. So a good example would be with anywhere from like 12 to 18 months before you go public. You're really trying to conserve cash. And that's a time where you're looking at everything. You're looking at your headcount, you're looking at your rate of hiring, you're looking at your investment in all the benefits, if you will, all of the things that are, frankly, costing you money. And some of the things I think that have come back to bite people is some of those decisions. Not a company I was involved with, but a company that is now public, spent exorbitant amount of money on ski trip for all the employees. And the intention was really good in terms of team building and whatnot. But when they were getting ready to go out into the world, out into the investment world, it wasn't viewed too favorably. Not to be taking away anything from employees, but what I think investments want to see is that you have a solid benefits plan, you have a solid 401k plan in place for people, you have some stickiness, that you're planning on doing an employee stock purchase program. So the real true wealth generating vehicles for employees, for people who've really helped you get to the promised land, if you will, making sure that you're taking care of your employees. Those are the things that the investors are going to want to look at versus all the gimmicky things. So I think that's where you can be a little bit short-sighted. I think the other thing around the corners is around managing your talent. there's usually somewhere between 5 and 10 critical positions in any company, any organization that create the most value or sort of the wealth generating positions in a company, sort of the differentiated positions. Having a good handle on what those positions are and ensuring you have a good comp strategy around those positions and ensuring you have the right talent in those positions. Those are positions I would describe as hard to replace if you lost them, difficult to hire in the market, and would cost you potentially 18 months of revenue. So really thinking about those positions. Example, at Costco, the biggest wealth generating position is the membership renewal. That's their biggest form of revenue. That's a critical position. So that's an example, but really understanding where those positions lie and looking around the corners. Do I have the right people? Am I mitigating risk? How are they doing? How much time do I spend with those 8 people? You know, that guy in the basement who's my only coder who knows how to do this one special thing. I don't even know who that guy is or woman. It's really that kind of stuff. It's anticipating all of those issues related to your people. Changes around policies, work from home, looking around the corners. What's going to happen a year from now when people don't want to come back to the office? Have you anticipated that? Have you anticipated your benefits program? Because guess what? They're going to look really different. They already do. People care about very different things. They want, coaches for their kids. They want tutoring. They need help with, childcare or whatever it might be. People want more flexibility. And it's that constant staying ahead of the market, ensuring that you're not going to become obsolete in your practices, but that you're also not going to go overboard and invest too much of things that don't really matter. So always sort of measuring and ensuring you have the right things in place to keep people pretty excited and motivated.
Love that. The thing that kind of came through loud and clear to me was 2 components. One around risk management. It seems like HR has a disproportionate impact from risks that you cannot really manage too well because they're external to you. And related to that is this question of uncertainty, right? What happens? Nobody knew what would happen in a pandemic, but that creates uncertainty. So it's sounding to me like risk and uncertainty have an extra heavy role to play in effective HR management, especially in a startup. So which leads me to the question that you were talking about in terms of compensation design. And that's an absolute critical cornerstone of how you manage a startup. High level, what are the components of a good compensation plan? And then we'll deep dive into each of those elements and how a founder should think about them.
The first thing you really need to be clear on is it's a set of goals. Really, what's your philosophy? Or well, let's even start higher. What is your philosophy around compensation? So I spent a lot of years at Hewlett Packard. Hewlett Packard was a pay for performance company in terms of its big philosophical, umbrella. So pay for performance, the way they thought about that was you had a set of goals, you had a set of metrics, you had a set a timeline, you had other things you were accountable for, you had some stretch goals. And if you met those things relative to others doing similar work or you exceeded expectations, you would be rewarded by more, whether it's stock or a higher pay bump or, maybe some other reward type of thing. So pay for performance was really the cornerstone of that philosophy. And everything around it was designed to support that, okay? Some companies don't have a pay for performance necessarily philosophy. It might be more of an egalitarian philosophy that we're going to give everybody, we're going to have more team and group goals. And if we achieve those, we're going to give everybody the same amount, whatever it might be. So you really want to think about culturally what you're basically communicating. Do you want to have strictly individual, more of an individualistic type of compensation scheme, or do you want to have something that's more balanced, maybe more, you're trying to drive people to be more collaborative, so you want to build that into your structure or your philosophy, if you will. So you really want to think about what it is you're trying to accomplish. Pay and compensation, total rewards, can take many, many different forms, as we know. But getting clear on your philosophical point of view and how sustainable that will be down the road and how you will think about administering that and any, again, unintended consequences of that. Because pay for performance sounds like a pretty good idea, right? However, the unintended consequence that came with pay for performance was this thing called ranking. And you may recall ranking. GE was big on this, Jack Welch, they called it the rank and yank. And being engineering companies, the only way they could figure out how they were going to pay for performance was to do this stack ranking, because you only have so much money. You have a pool of dollars and you have to distribute that amongst 10 people or 15 people. So how do you do that? You stack rank people. Unintended consequence of pay for performance was stack ranking. People hated it. At the end of the cycle, the compensation cycle, you had maybe 2 people who were happy and 95% of your workforce that was angry and felt cheated, and you'd see attrition. People would get their bonus and leave. Get their raise, little raise they got, and they'd be out of there. So unintended consequences of something that I think started off as feeling very fair and feeling very egalitarian. If I think of, the HP way, wonderful philosophy, wonderful, treatment of people, and truly a legendary company, very cutting edge, especially at the time, in the 1930s when they set up the company. To have those progressive policies was really unheard of. So it's not a criticism of that philosophy, but it's a criticism of the way in which they approach the mechanics of how to support that philosophy. So compensation design is super complicated. So really thinking about, in a very thoughtful way, what is it you're trying to accomplish? And then from there, what are the metrics that you're going to use to accomplish that particular outcome? So I'll give you an example. The last company I was with, the main metric for executives was ACV, actual contract value. And the board felt very strongly that that was the only metric. I shouldn't say the only, but it was a pretty important metric that executives needed to be held accountable for. And that was everyone. Everyone on that executive team had an accountability. Now, we had other things that we were accountable to and for as well, but that was the unifying goal, was really around growing the company and around revenue. So that metric, while it's not necessarily one that you would keep forever, was really important for driving, this high growth company and wanting to, ensure that people were aligned around that goal. So philosophy, what kind of, goals you want to have in place for people, and how you're going to hold them accountable. What are those metrics going to look like? And what's that alignment going to look like from one group to the other? Now, some companies believe in cascading metrics, that you start at the top and you cascade those goals all the way down. I'd say an unintended consequence of that is if people can't see themselves in those goals and metrics, they're not going to be too excited. So I would caution cascading metrics. That would be another design principle. The other thing, when you're designing a comp strategy, you have to sit down with your investors and who's funding you and really see what you can even afford. Okay. What is affordable? What is doable? How much equity are you going to put in the pool? For founders and startups, if you're not giving people equity, they're probably not going to join your company. Okay. So you have to have some sort of an equity plan, whether it's stock options, whether it's restricted stock units, whether it's key milestones that people achieve, and then you give them some sort of, reward at the end of that period. All of those things really, really matter to incent people. If they're not incented, if they don't feel, especially the early people who come into the organization who are going to help you build your company, there should be, in my opinion, a differentiation of those people who've kind of hung in there with you longer. They should be able to see that value and see that growth over time. Whereas people who come later typically don't receive the same amounts. It's just kind of par for the course. So at some point, you have to level out the difference between, as a startup, you typically can't pay people as competitively, a base salary and bonus programs. But typically you can compensate for that, or compensate from a lack of 401k match, things like that you're not going to have early on with more options. So that's typically where you want to make sure that you've got that right balance of something that is attractive enough to people and competitive enough. Where I think stock programs are going to struggle a little bit more is in today's market. There's ups and downs in the stock market, obviously, but companies taking longer to go public means more anticipation of refresh programs, having to refresh that stock a little bit more often, having to keep it interesting for people. The longer your company stays private, if you will, you're going to have to innovate more on the product side, probably a lot more to get to that point before you get that infusion of cash and help and mentoring and all those things your company's going to need. So it can be a really long haul, the time you start to the time you start to see some profitability. Design, super important of how all of that is going to come together.
That was a fantastic overview. Actually, it opened my eyes to many things I hadn't been aware of before. You talked about metrics and how these fundamental impact or value related metrics should be at the heart of any design of any compensation, at least at the senior executive level. What has been your observation or even your advice in terms of how a founder should select those metrics? And also related to that, to what extent do you typically see investors weighing in on the selection of those metrics?
Investors will weigh in. And I shared the one with the actual contract value. And so they will definitely weigh in depending on their functional expertise and their experience. Thank goodness, right? They're offering you some really sage advice, truly. And that's why they've been so successful, many of them. So I'd say for the metrics around values, one way of doing it really depends on the company. Over time, you typically have an annual survey, or you have a quarterly survey, or you have a pulse survey, which gives feedback from the employee perspective about how well the company is doing on living its values. And you have essentially a kind of like a net promoter score that you can use to keep you honest, to help you understand how are we doing, how are people feeling. Are we doing what we said we were going to do? Are we doing right by these people? What could we be doing better? And this is where that listening strategy really comes into play, and being transparent with people that, hey, we failed this quarter. We didn't communicate new benefits as well as we should have, or we didn't communicate our strategy, or we've been confusing our employees about certain things, or we haven't provided the right tools for you to be successful in doing your job. Those are the kinds of things that you definitely want to keep a good handle on with your employees. So values can be measured. They can be measured through things like your surveys. I don't like annual surveys personally. They're too in the past looking. I like forward looking things. Just a simple pulse survey helps you with your values. Another example from a previous company, we would measure the turnover or attrition of certain key positions. It was a core engineering group that was very, very important to the company, very valuable. We would reach below a certain level. It affected all the bonuses across the board. It wasn't HR's problem. It wasn't engineering's problem. It wasn't go-to-market's problem. It was all of our problem. And so it affected a percentage of that bonus payout. Depending on what you want, you can put some people metrics in there for sure. And then obviously you can put your business ones in there. I'm not so sure attrition for startups is such a great metric. I would use it more for like just key positions, because attrition is going to run between 17 and 22% for startups, which seems really high, but it's actually pretty average.
Got it. And that's helpful. Values is great, but that also triggered the value in terms of the value creation of the company itself as a startup. What has been your observation in terms of how much that key metric like the ACV that you mentioned is understood and well used by founders and saying, you know what, this is the thing that's going to drive how well my company does, and how much thought has gone into that?
Super well understood. And a lot of thought from experience from the investment community. And one thing I will say about that too, and this might be helpful advice for the founders. If you've got something that's kind of a non-negotiable, when I say non-negotiable, everything's negotiable, I guess, to some degree. But when you know that your investors value something, that something is very near and dear to their heart, you want to pay attention to that. And it doesn't mean you can't argue with it or you can't look for other things, but you also have to respect that point of view, I guess, is the right way to say it. Because you will have, as a CEO and founder, your team will pressure you for other metrics. Your team will pressure you for other things that they want to be accountable for or want to get credit for. And those may be very different things than what your investors value. You most likely will have some conflict along the way, especially if things aren't going as well from a comp perspective. Let's say you aren't hitting your metrics. If you're not hitting your metrics, you probably shouldn't get rewarded for that. However, when people are in the trenches and it's a slog and they're not getting rewarded for their efforts, then they become restless and they want to then renegotiate some of those metrics. And I think that is a maybe unintended or unforeseen consequence, but that's one of those corners to look around that can cause some discontent. And that's also where I think some coaching or getting some advice, in having those conversations with whether it's your chair or your member of your comp committee, some of those conversations around other ways of continuing to engage people. So I'd say that's been very real time. No confusion from the investors, certainly ever, about what they want to see. Sometimes you're going to have to negotiate a little bit, but appreciate the point of view, certainly, of where those investors are coming from, because they really want the company to be successful.
That's excellent counsel. So that brings us to the next big topic, which is employee stock option plans. I know that comes up very early on, as you mentioned, for the right reasons. At a high level, can you just provide an overview of what should a founder be thinking about as they set up and design their ESOP? Now, I do understand that a lot of this has legal implications. I understand that you're not a lawyer. So I just would like to talk about it from the point of view of a business partner and an HR perspective. What should a founder be thinking about in setting up their ESOP?
So the ESOP, as we talked a little bit about, needs to be well designed, needs to ensure that it motivates in the right way, it's sustainable and affordable, okay, that you have enough in the pool, if you will, and that is being managed. Probably going to need to have somebody in stock administration. So whether you do that through a consultant or through a firm or you bring somebody in, it has to be managed. So stock administration is really important because there are some compliance issues. You need to make sure you're understanding what you're distributing, what's coming back into the pool, making sure that you're being accountable to your investors about not diluting your stock pool, if you will. So paying really close attention to what's in there. Just the management of it is really, really critical. Also on the design, thinking about what you're going to need in what I would call your reserves. So down the road, are you going to have any key hires? Are you going to replace the founder with a professional CEO? Are you going to need anything for merit increases or quarterly retention or refresh on stock? So all of those things need to be part of those discussions and really figure out what the right amount is. Typically, when you start, there's no value. You're not profitable. You haven't had an analysis done. No one has come in, much like an audit, to even give you a valuation on your company. Obviously, you're going to want to get some advice from your investors, from the attorneys. You're going to want to really understand that you have enough to do what it is you need to do. Because from my perspective, you don't want to keep going back to your board and asking for more. You want to manage within what everybody has agreed to be reasonable, unless obviously there's some crazy unforeseen thing that could come along, or you have an opportunity to hire some, rock star person that you need some stock for. But again, those situations I think are pretty rare. The other thing to think about is education. So from a pure HR perspective, many of the people you're going to be hiring are early career stage, oftentimes, not always, but you're going to have people who have maybe never received a large amount of stock options. Maybe they were in a position where stock options in a large company weren't even really part of their compensation package. It would be more typical that they would have restricted stock, which operate very, very different. But an option basically is somebody has to outlay cash if they want to buy it. Once it's vested, investing period will be another very important design element. You want to do a 3-year vest, a 4-year vest. On options, it's typically a 4-year vest. Again, that vesting schedule is pretty important. Is it going to have enough stickiness, enough hold to keep somebody in their seat long enough? And is it going to have enough potential value to keep somebody retained? Or are they going to go next door and somebody will basically buy out their stock options for them? So vesting period, making sure you have enough in your pool, that the outlay of cash is an important one from an employee perspective. So until somebody purchases them, they're really not issued. It's not your grant. Whereas an RSU, it's your grant as soon as you accept that grant and you pay the taxes and whatnot. For options, it's very, very different. It's a long time. It's outlay of cash. If somebody leaves the company, do they want to pay for those? Do they want to negotiate a longer window in which to purchase those stock options? Lots of complications that do definitely go with those options. They can be great, but they can also, for some people, feel like I'm never going to get anything out of these. They're kind of worthless. At least with an RSU, I have cash in hand, I pay the taxes, I can spend that money. So you really want to think about the design and the timing. Educating employees on all these different types of stock options and how they work and the mechanics is super important because, like I said, you have a lot of early career stage people don't really understand them. Even my experience in public companies, people didn't really understand the value of options. They left right before something was going to vest, just left cash on the table, didn't really understand that. Educating them about the timing, educating them about, what they would have to pay in order to receive those, all of those things, and the value and the potential value. Not that you want to mislead people or promise something, but really helping them understand how those options could look over time. That's the piece, kind of modeling that for employees is really important to help them see what that potential is. So I think people can get excited about those things and options are going to be great, but they're going to have to find that right mix of people being able to see the value. And that takes a lot of communication and a lot of education in order to be able to get the outcome you want from people and performance.
You laid it out really well because what I'm hearing is you really need a bench of expertise to design and implement an ESOP. And that bench has the HR person as the business lead. It has the investors because obviously it's going to affect the cap table and how much gets allocated to the employee stock option plan. And it also has potentially outside legal counsel to help you design your plan in a legally compliant way.
Yes, it's a heavily regulated program, if you will, as it should be. Many companies years ago got in lots and lots of trouble for not doing things correctly. So again, risk, consequence, really, really important. The other thing too to think about in the design is whether you have the new hire stock approved monthly. One recommendation I would have is to time your new hires. So you're going to bring 10 people in a month or 5 people in a month. Let's say it's the 15th is when you do all your, bring all your new hires in for the orientation. Try to match that up with your stock grants being approved on the 15th of the month. Do that close. Don't cheat employees a month or 2 or a quarter. They hate that.
Provided you educated them or they're already educated about what it means to have.
It's a little bit of both. It's a little bit of both. And that's where, you really want to be mindful of, again, the impact on people. It may not seem like a big deal, and somebody maybe in the financial engineering background would say, oh, but look, we can delay this 3 months. We can get 6 more months out of these people. And it's not cool. The things you do up front to show people, you're signaling to them, you're part of this team right now. I want you to contribute. Here's your comp, your potential comp. Why would I delay you? It's like, I'm going to not give you your paycheck for 3 more months. It's kind of interesting. All those little things signal to people how you are treating them. And this is where you do want HR and finance lined up. And my experience in some companies would be finance had a heavy amount of influence in a lot of areas than they probably should have, because the decisions that were made were very singularly financial decisions versus really looking at all of those implications. And so one other thing I'll say about HR, if you're going to bring somebody in from HR, do not have them report to the CFO or to your chief operating officer. Anybody worth their salt won't take the job
because
it will become an administrative G&A function, and it will just be squeezed and squeezed and squeezed from an employee perspective till there's no more budget whatsoever. And I speak from experience, and all of my colleagues, if the job reports to the CFO, the CHRO, they will not take the job. They won't even interview.
So as a founder, your job is to make sure that the CHRO is always a direct to you.
That's right, in my opinion.
I love it. I love it. It makes total sense. And so one more thing is on this ESOP, and then we'll move on, is are there the mistakes that you see founders make repeatedly in terms of how they design or administer their ESOPs?
It's so interesting with the timing. Let's say you're like 18 months away from going public. I'll use the going public for a moment. You're going to have to make a decision to stop using options, right? Because you're burning through more shares with your options. And you're going to have to convert over to RSUs. So when you make that decision, that's a really important thing from a business perspective, because it can really affect what you're going to have on the other end of going public. It can affect your value as well. So when you make that decision, or even thinking about a hybrid at some point between RSUs, restricted stock units, and options, those things become important. I have seen when you say mistakes, I don't know if it's so much a mistake, it was just strange. I saw a company, I won't name the company, but for a very, very long time, they still offered options to their CEO. And it was very, very strange. And I just think it was a cleanup kind of thing. And eventually it got cleaned up and changed to RSUs and some other types of performance shares. And performance shares typically come later for the executive team. But I thought that was weird, and it was burning more equity, and it was not it was an very odd design. Again, I think it was just more of somebody just not really paying attention. Just make sure you're keeping a handle on your dilution, you're keeping a handle on consistency with hiring. Every month, we'll review what shares went out for new hires as a good example, or if you had a merit program. You want to look at that and understand, really, was there equity from a gender representation perspective? You want to pay attention to all of those things. You gave away all this stock. Did it do what it was supposed to do, or did you wind up losing some people? Why was that? So again, kind of that look back in your program to make sure you're not making the mistakes, if you will, that it's achieving its objectives and its outcomes. I'd say those are some of the things I have to think about.
That really brought out to me loud and clear why you said and why it was important to look at HR as a business function, because all of these are business implications and not just air quotes HR implications, because they all impact every aspect of your business.
Good HR is going to be looking at all of the analytics all the time. And there's so many great tools out there that we now have at our disposal. So we can create dashboards that with some simple software show us where we have problems with inequity, where we might have a correction we need to make. As one company, we had to shore up about 7% of our females to make sure that they were being paid an equitable. Obviously, there were some issues, and had to do a quick correction. And so having that kind of exposure to the data is really, really important. So, who are you paying? Why are you paying them this? What's happening? How's their performance? If you have underperformance, paying attention to that. If you know you have an underperformer and you see on your reports, why did we give this person it? Why did they get a merit? Those are the kinds of things that, again, an HR business partner would be sitting down with you and looking at on a fairly regular basis to make sure you've got a good handle on.
Excellent. So you mentioned this issue of pay equity and the fact that female employees were underpaid. As a founder and CEO, what should you know and what should you be paying attention to in terms of pay equity and transparency and pay parity?
Yeah, so a tool I absolutely love is called Syndio, Syndio. I believe it's a group of analytic people and maybe some ex-lawyers are in there. It had been a fairly small company. And they created this, and I have nothing to do with them. I'm not an advisor to them or anything. So nothing to be gained other than I think it's a great resource for people. And essentially what it does, it provides you with a scattergram or a report of all your departments. It shows you promotion rates. So you're asking what to pay attention to. Promotion rates, how quickly are your females versus males versus folks in underrepresented groups being promoted? Is there any sort of inequity occurring there? And if so, why? What's going on there? Points you to kind of where to look. Hey, what's going on with pay? How come, women are receiving much less on their merit increases? So how do we do with merit increases? How are we doing on base pay, bonuses? How are we doing on that? How are we doing on overall equity position for basically the whole for various groups? And you should see pretty visually where you have any gaps. Frankly, I'm very proud to say in many of the companies, once we were able to really look at the data, can quickly address anything. And the fact that you're sitting down with your CEO and looking at that data, people's behavior got much better in terms of paying people much more fairly and much more equitably. Now, obviously, there's going to be some leeway. You're going to have some people paid more depending on the position it is, or how long they've been with the company, or whatever it might be. But it gives you a pretty good indication. So those are the things to look at. Rate of promotion is very important. Or if you don't have as many women going for those promotions, it can point you in that direction as well. Why is that? Are they not being encouraged? Are they not being developed? Is there an issue with their confidence? They just need a mentor. They need a coach. What's happening? So you can tell a lot from the data, frankly, and pay transparency, same thing. Companies are being asked to show not necessarily, line up all your employees and let's talk about what every single person in the company makes, but really understanding what the ranges are. So again, something founders need to be thinking about is how they want to design their comp structure. Are we going to have 3 buckets? Are we going to have 29 job levels? Are we going to have, special positions for special kinds of roles? What are we going to do? Because we're going to have to be transparent about it. And we're going to have to make sure our employees understand what those job levels are and what it takes to kind of go from one level to the next. Now, in startups, typically more levels are introduced so people can feel and see that they're progressing. So what you'll see in a more mature company is maybe 3 big buckets for professional roles and 3 big buckets for managerial roles. Google's a good example. They don't have a lot of job levels. But they got a lot of people. And so they pay their people very well, and everybody's very happy about. They usually don't complain about salary. They complain about other things, but not really salary so much. So you'll want to make those kind of decisions clear, transparent. What are those job levels? And what's the bottom of that? What's the midpoint? What's the top of that job level pay? And so people can have a pretty good understanding of where they're at. A lot of companies now are publishing their rate ranges with their job posting. So the value of the job is disclosed right from the get-go. Bonus programs are very clear with what the metrics are and timeline. So I think people are requiring more and more transparency to make sure that as negotiators, women typically or historically haven't negotiated as well or seen the value of their worth in the same way, unfortunately, some men have. And this is a way to, I think, help close that gap and make sure that they're asking the right questions. And I think HR and I think the talent acquisition function is also doing a much better job of reviewing those offers and raising the flag. It's like, we're not going to pay this person 20% less for this job that is valued at this. So I think that's really important to do the right thing. And, people feel, I think they feel much more valued and they feel much more collaborative and more agreeable to working with somebody. If you're sitting next to somebody, they're making, you came in at the same time and they're making more money than you're not going to feel too great towards them. And everybody finds out. Everything's transparent. People go online, say all kinds of stuff. So people typically are going to find out. They're going to know.
So this is great. If you wouldn't mind, I'm going to play devil's advocate on a couple of things, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. The first is, you talked about the Syndio or whatever its cousin and peer tools are. My pushback to you would be, if I wanted to be a hard-edged person, I would say, well, ignorance is bliss, and I'm the founder. If what I don't know, I cannot be held liable to. So what is the incentive for me to even look at it when I'm busy trying to survive and get traction? That's my first question. My second question is, my perception of at least venture capital funded companies is that they tend to skew heavily male and white. So we know there's an inequity already in the funding system. And I would argue that flows down all the way to things like pay and stuff like that. So those are the 2 questions I have to you, which is number 1, what is the incentive for a founder to even look at this? And what are you seeing in terms of trends? And then secondly, given the heavy skew of who the investing entities are, what is your assessment or prognosis that pay parity is even going to make any real impact?
Yeah. So great questions. So why should a founder care? Ignorance is bliss, right? Well, it is until it isn't. So it may be for a little while, but eventually people will either talk, or if a person senses they aren't being comped fair market value, and people do check. Don't be confused. People are being recruited all the time, especially if they're talented and good. And especially if they're female, especially if they're in an underrepresented group, because people have to meet their diversity and inclusion goals. Okay. Even founders and startups and boards, they want to see those stats, and they want to look at those stats. They want to look at pay, and they'll look at it, and they'll see if you're doing something that is unsavory, if you will. So I think VC firms, I think CEOs, they're under much more scrutiny, they're much more accountable. And I think the ignorance is bliss argument, if you will, is fine until it isn't. And it usually, something will come up. It's sort of like looking the other way if you see harassment. It's looking the other way if you've had what I'd call an incident at work, and eventually it just gets worse and worse. So founders, it's the new world. It's the new transparent world, and it's not going away. It's going to only get more visible to people. And again, from an integrity and values perspective, I mean, if your values are, I only want to hire white men, be honest about it. And don't try to recruit women or underrepresented groups into your company, because they're not going to be very happy and very excited to be there. So I think that's one. And I think from the VC world, I actually think they're doing a much better job, some of them, in this area. They're putting more and more people in their firms that are female. They are doing more to support female founders, and spending more time really trying to support and help them. But they're just as accountable. So they have a reputation of harassing people in their firm, or not paying people from an equitable perspective, or not treating women well. I mean, we all have read the headlines. I won't go into the specifics, some of them, but some of the bigger firms definitely have their share of bad press when it came to all of this stuff. So when I was talking earlier about reputation management, it matters. This world of transparency is one of the biggest shifts that we're seeing, and it's a much more democratic workforce. And young people talk. They're not embarrassed to tell you what they make.
Awesome. I love it. That's very helpful. And frankly, it's also quite heartening to hear that the shift is definitely happening in the right direction. So thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. So the last topic I want to talk about is the intersection of the HR role with the world of money. And by that, I mean both in the fundraising stage and at an exit stage, whether it's through an acquisition or through an IPO. Can you talk first about the fundraising stage and what role HR plays in that process?
So as an advisor to several different companies, as I mentioned, I have been involved with customer visits, meeting with CEOs of different companies, right along with the founder and other people on the advisory board, to share a perspective about how the product works from an HR perspective. So I have personally not gone in and said, would you write me a check for such and such for this company? But I think it certainly is not off the table, depending on what it is. I think if you've got the kind of relationship between the CEO or founder and the CHRO that can really show the integrity of the company, that these are good people to work with, this is our talent strategy, this is how we're going to get all these people to do all of these things, this is how we're going to get this call center set up, those types of things, you may be pulled in and can be very instrumental in getting and securing an investment. So I think it varies what you're trying to do, and it doesn't replace the founder by any stretch, or the CEO, but you can enhance that opportunity. On the exit strategy, it's very common that when you're meeting with the bankers, you have the opportunity. They want to hear from all of the functional areas. They want to know about the culture of the company. They ask a lot of questions about diversity, equity, and inclusion. They want to see your statistics on all of that. So I provided all of that business, and what we do for our communities. Philanthropy is also super important to investors, and that you're a good citizen out in the community. And people want to see that reputation that, you maybe have a small foundation in your company established. You give a day off for volunteerism. If you say you're this values-driven company and you're into sustainability or whatever you're into, they're going to look for that kind of stuff. They're going to want to make sure that you're walking the walk. And that's where HR can help you in a lot of ways, really inform that sense of culture and that you're not just BSing them, that you really have the data to back it up.
Awesome. I love it. This has been extraordinarily informative, even to me, and I'm sure it's going to be to a lot of women out there looking to start businesses. So to summarize, what would you give away, or what would you say are the top 5 takeaways for a founder, early stage founder, in terms of things to keep in mind or do from an HR perspective?
I was thinking about that question. I would say that, remember, the world of work has changed significantly, and it's going to look even more different in the next 5 years. There'll be more transparency, as I mentioned, more democratic on the part of the employees, more opportunity for a listening strategy and not to miss. When I say listening strategy, it's not just employees, it's customers. Really paying attention to your customers and your employees. Have your house in order. All of your documentation, if you will, is cleaned up in case you have a acquisition. You're ready to go. HR can also help you with that because you're going to need all those documents, your benefits plans, your stock plans, your employee files, all of that stuff. As boring as that may sound, always be ready to go with all of those things. I'd say periods, cycles will be longer. People will be less patient, maybe. So talent becomes increasingly important, and really getting the culture and the talent right is just paramount to your success.
Fantastic. I love it. Is there anything I should have asked you, but I didn't?
Yes. One piece of advice for founders who find themselves in the wonderful position of going public. People can become very interesting at that inflection. One word of advice would be to really look at all of your change and control agreements and understand what's in them and understand how those are designed. We didn't really talk about that, but some people can get very political and very greedy towards a public offering, and will try to renegotiate everything. And you're in a difficult position at that point, especially if you have a suitor who is trying to buy you. What I mean by difficult position is when somebody's trying to buy you, they want the whole lot. And that's contractual. And so people sometimes will surprise you and come back in and try to renegotiate a lot of things for their personal interest, for their personal financial gain. And as a founder, this is where, having a backbone and having a sense of, and frankly, investors, having a backbone and really being equitable and fair across the company. And that's not one person who makes a company. So I think it's important to have a good handle on that. And if you're concerned about that type of behavior, weed it out early, because eventually that person is never going to be satisfied. And they're just going to cost you a lot of equity, and they're going to create a lot of animosity amongst the team. That's unfortunate, but it's human nature when there's a lot at stake.
That is awesome and well received. Thank you very much. Is there anything specific that you'd offer to female founders that would be over and above or different from any of what we talked about high level?
There's a couple, depending if the female founders have a board member. If their board members or advisors can introduce them to other female CEOs or people, or even leaders of HR. Some of my former founders will call me and say, hey, can you talk to such and such person? They're getting ready for HR. Will you talk to them for an hour? Yeah, sure. So I think the network, just the network of good people. Some of the other resources for founders, the executive MBA program at Stanford or Harvard, they have a whole section on organizational development and organizational psychology. I think it's a must for CEOs. It's just one of the most important dimensions they should expose themselves to. Mentors, old bosses. And the other one I would suggest is the Young Presidents Club. Lots of people in startups and tech belong to that. And it's important for women and people in underrepresented groups to be out there rubbing elbows with a lot of influential people. And they also do a lot of development for people. But it's just the power of that network is incredible.
Excellent.
Great.
Susan, this has been, the hour and a half has flown by. I just cannot tell you how much I appreciate your generosity in sharing your advice, your experiences, and counsel, not just with me, but with so many other women who I'm sure will benefit from it. So thank you so much for your time and for your counsel.
It's been a delight, and I really wish all of the founders and everybody out there all the best. I have such admiration for all the entrepreneurs and innovators of the world. It's a lot. And last but not least, advice, take care of yourself, take care of your health and your stress levels if you can, and make time each day for yourself and your loved ones. Really important. Can't be all business.
HR is one of those things no founder really stops to think about, but it's an important lever to set up your startup on a great footing. Susan's treatment of this topic was really masterful and engaging. Here are my top takeaways from this conversation. 1. The fact that you even need a compensation philosophy for your company, for example, pay for performance versus collaboration, was really eye-opening to me. 2. This idea of unintended consequences in HR management and the great examples she shared really resonated with me. 3. Having a phased approach to tackling all the HR tasks for your startup from the earliest days was a really helpful tip. I particularly like the milestones she set out to help you figure out where you are in that journey. 4. Susan gave some excellent advice on how not to succumb to your comfort zones in allocating your time between the different functions in your startup. Leaning into your discomfort is so important to get things like HR right. 5. Why it's so important for you as the founder and CEO to constantly be looking around corners to see what might be coming down the pike that others might not. That really resonated. 6. It's important for you to be grounded and informed when setting up your overall compensation and incentives package for your startup. Susan shared so much rich insight on this topic that are really not seen as accessible anywhere else. 7. Related to that, Susan gave an excellent layperson's overview of what you need to know on the business end of an employee stock option plan. Of course, you need legal counsel to set one up right, but you always have responsibility as the business leader in how it's designed. Last but not least, I loved Susan's grounded views on how you can and should be fair and equitable to all your employees and be a good steward of your business and investors' money. So, what's the one area you can work on in your startup? And what action are you going to take on it tomorrow? Thanks for listening to today's episode. We have show notes and more at achieve.co. That's achieve.co/podcast. Like what you heard? Hit subscribe and share with a friend. See you on the next episode. Now, go be an achiever.